let me go ahead and tell you a little bit about our panelists today. We got Paul. Paul's company is building a really great scalable solution, and Paul is he's a constructive critic of blockchain technology, and so he's done a lot of work really identifying what the holes are, what the vulnerabilities are, what the challenges are, and then looking for solutions. So his criticism and solutions are going to be great.
I see scalability as a more holistic issue, and and again, from a sort of process dynamics, the one thing I'd recommend to people, and my background, is that you always do the swim lane workflow just to see the dynamics, the control points, and the dependencies. And that, if that isn't documented for your solution, not a schematic with boxes and arrows, but a true swim lane workflow, then it throws up what your issues are. And then the last thing you do in a product design is actually the accounting plan. How are you going to show the double entry accounting around these solutions? Because if you don't, you're setting yourself up to have some difficult discussions with your auditor. And the way I'd like you to consider it is whenever you join a protocol, Ethereum or Hyperledger or everything, you can download the entire history, and you don't go back to the committee and get votes on it. You can see all the digital signatures and the hash links and everything else, and you can validate it on your own. Yet it's that next set of transactions, or the edge of the blockchain, is where you need the committee to decide. And what we did was took the property of the history and gave it to the transactions so they could validate on their own without the need to sort of confer with the network.
Paul, if people want to connect with you, what's sort of the great sort of synergy there that they can connect?
They can find me on LinkedIn, and by all means follow me. You can see a link to, if you look at my posts, or we also have I'm just posting a thing, page for our company, L4S Corporation. So I'm just posting that now.
When are you gonna be putting a product out soon, or what's your sort of release schedule?
The goal is probably third quarter next year if we raise the funding we're expecting. So we are obviously interested in any Series A investors or target clients for use cases. If you're not in that initial run for our production, you'd be lined up early as soon as we're launched. But the idea of the design as well is it's both process, asset, and life cycle agnostic. So the assets and the counting are configurable.
Excellent.
Looking at scalability, the obvious one is the performance. The less obvious ones are functionality and ease of adoption.
So solutions like Hashgraph and some of those asynchronous methods, right? Would you say that a multi-threaded architecture is going to be significantly more scalable than, say, a single-threaded architecture?
Yes, in principle and in concept, yes. The problem with some of those solutions is that I talked about the fact that they still remain interdependent. And so there's a communication of, what they talk about, the virtual voting in Hashgraph of, gossiping about gossiping. So there's a lot of overlap and redundancy. And the latency there is between events created and events generated and events agreed. So absolutely, parallel processing on multi-threads is the key. The trick, though, is, like I said, like TCP/IP, is to remain independent yet interlinked. If you imagine a series of nodes and each node creates 10 transactions, then they have to sign, their transactions, but they have to vote on the other nodes' transactions and then count everybody else's. Yeah. So if you have 3 nodes, you sign your 10, but you've got to vote on 20 from the other 2 nodes. But there's 2 nodes that also voted on 20, so you have 2 times 20, which is 40. Go to 4 nodes, and you have 3 times 30, which is now 90 votes to count. Go to 5 nodes, you've got 4 times 40, 160. Then 5 times 50, 250. And you can see it exponentially. The amount of votes that have to be counted goes up exponentially as the network expands. This is the horizontal scaling.
Yeah, Paul.
Just quickly, I wanted to say one of the issues I brought up at the beginning was the lack of double entry accounting in a lot of these solutions, and this is key for anything that's going to call itself a ledger. And it's certainly a topic, and also the idea of workflowing use cases, and that's an area where people have often come to us to sort of say, how do we decipher these things? And that's a key aspect that most people have forgotten, and it's actually going to be a problem in the future if it's not really addressed.
So, Paul, tell us about that whole concept of consistency versus consensus, because you talked about it briefly.
Consistency without consensus.
Right.
The key thing to recognize is that and I'll try and do this in as simple example as possible. So consensus in any form expands exponentially and gets slower with greater participation, so it works in limited use cases, but it's not going to be the sort of the grand solution to everybody, as well as the fact that you've got to transmit those votes, receive them, count them, and then decide that you've got a good enough number. So that whole latency thing kicks in as well. So that's where, if you can get consistency without consensus, you've obviously gone to a linearly scalable and very high capacity throughput and low latency processing. And we achieved it with our design, but then I found this research that sort of kind of backed it up. And where it originated from was, I believe this researcher was working with Google. If you imagine, Google maps the internet in its various regions, and then the regions communicate their internet mapping to the other regions. Well, how do the other regions know that they're consistent, that they got all the information, that there's no conflicting information? And so this theory was, if the data included certain properties, that you would be, and there's a concept, if you just blast things across the network, there's a concept of eventual consistency, which is eventually everyone will get all the information. The problem is you have no idea whether you're in conflict or anything. With these properties, it was claimed they had strong eventual consistency, which means they would definitely get consistent, they just wouldn't know when, but they would not have any conflicts. And if you think about a blockchain, if I gave you the Bitcoin blockchain, you can reconstruct it. And if I told you there's 555,000 blocks today and you have 4,999, you know you're missing one. So there's your completeness. So what we were able to do was create a construct such that we had consistency without consensus and completeness as well. So each of the nodes are processing their transactions and sending it to the network, and the transactions are self-synchronizing. So that's the strong eventual consistency, was the concept of consistency without having to synchronize, which then obviates the need for voting. And I'd make a point to this, because if you can get to near real-time settlement, and you've got that level of control, and this goes back to the controls that banks and brokers use all day long. People want to forget about them, but they've got some pretty good ideas around control, that you can actually stop the double spend at inception. And my argument with a lot of the solutions is that they claim to solve the double spend, but they actually don't. And they include Bitcoin. The reason why is because the double spend is allowed to happen, but through the mining process or the voting, one or other of those transactions is rejected, or possibly the network rejects both. So that's not really stopping the double spend, it's arbitrarily selecting either or neither. And that's not because most double spends are not people trying to trick Bob while they're paying Charlie, all right? It's not that. It's the fact that you swiped your debit card twice by accident, or you went to write a check. Now, the problem is if I paid Alice by accident and I meant to pay Bob, I want the Bob payment to go through. But the current networks would actually arbitrarily pick Alice or Bob or neither. And what we're saying is that you should be wary of your payment and be told that at the point, so that at the point where you go to see Bob payment, you would actually know you've made a mistake and you can rectify it. But so there is this research that backs up the idea of consistency without consensus. But how we've made it work across the network is part of our secret sauce.
Got it.
So, I started my career as actually a manufacturing engineer. My degree's in engineering. I then transitioned to a sort of management program in the UK, was banking operations, and I spent a good time in operations and service, and then moved to sort of product management and then innovation and design across many of the sort of large institutional banks and brokers. I've also consulted independently. My last role, I was working on internalizing trades. We had the idea of, settling in trades within a larger institution where they have both sides of the transaction, and that was going to get us to T0. And that was around about the time blockchain was taking off, as well as the fact that I happened to transfer to a boutique consultancy, so they asked me to look into it. And as my wife has said, the planets aligned. My father was involved in encryption with radios, so I knew about that sort of technology, although I don't usually admit it too much in public, although I'm doing it very proudly now. I have a lay interest in like number theory and meta mathematics, and I've read the papers of Gödel and Turing. So when you deal with blockchain and you're confronted with modular mash and hashing or elliptic curve encryption, I don't claim to be an expert, but I'm not intimidated in the, I understand the principles. So that got me to the nice bits. But as a process guy and a design guy around process control, I looked at what was out there, and it's about 4 or 5 years ago, and said, great, I now know what the potential is. I know why everyone's excited about it. But I saw some limitations within the performance and functionality and ease of adoption, and I'll come to those points when we start off. But and really, I thought those would be the challenges that people would be looking to solve for. But there's a lot of access to downloadable or open source software solutions, and that's where people were going. But I kind of locked myself in the room and sort of said, okay, how would I solve for these 10 challenges? And came up with a different type of design. Initially we weren't a fintech startup, so we were trying to propose it to banks and brokers and anybody who'd listen. And then that led to us actually saying, okay, we've got to start a venture here. And so we seed funded, and we've got now a capabilities demo, which is going to help us raise Series A funding. And we hope to have a production version for our targeted clients. And also in the meantime, we also offer advisory and due diligence services in this space, because the one thing I'm happy about is that I got into blockchain 5 years ago. With all the progression and evolution and noise, it's a pretty steep hill to climb for any new people coming in. So I've recorded videos on LinkedIn where I'm trying to sort of outline some of the points and issues for educational purposes, as well as just to help people understand them.